Imagine this for a moment. You're in Harare on an ordinary Tuesday evening. The sun sets, but the city doesn't light up. Street vendors pack their goods before darkness swallows the sidewalks. In one neighborhood, a small grocery store rushes to save what little frozen food it can before the power vanishes again, because tonight, like so many nights this year, Zimbabwe faces another 18-hour blackout. Inside a crowded hospital, the low rumble of a diesel generator becomes the only heartbeat keeping the ICU alive. Nurses wipe sweat from their foreheads as machines flicker under barely enough power. A father waits in the corridor, worried that the generator will run out before sunrise. In the distance, you hear the restless hum of frustration, a nation trapped by an energy crisis it did not create. And then, something unexpected happens. Just 3 days ago, inside the State House in Harare, a quiet but historic signing took place. No dramatic speeches, no global cameras. But what emerged from that room has the power to remake the economic map of southern Africa. Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote, placed $1 billion on the table, along with a plan for a 2,000-kilometer energy pipeline that could turn one of the most energy-starved nations in Africa into an unlikely hub. Western oil executives are watching closely. Chinese energy strategists are taking notes. Zimbabwe's neighbors, Botswana, Zambia, Malawi, are quietly recalculating their future. Because when a man who once abandoned Zimbabwe as too risky suddenly comes back after 10 years, something deeper is shifting. So the real question for us today is this: what changed? Why is Dangote returning now? And can one pipeline truly transform a landlocked country into a regional energy powerhouse? If you're someone who believes Africa is beginning to solve African problems at African prices, stay with me. And if even one part of this story changes how you see the continent's future, consider supporting this channel, because the truth matters more than the headlines. When you look at Zimbabwe's economy today, it's impossible to ignore the human cost of its energy crisis. In the early hours of the morning, long before the sun rises, families wake up to the cold silence of powerless homes. Mothers try to boil water on small charcoal burners because electric kettles have become decorative objects, silent reminders of a grid that no longer works. Children prepare for school by flashlight. For many Americans, this may feel like a distant inconvenience, but in Zimbabwe, it is a daily reality that shapes every aspect of life. By midday, entire industrial zones fall quiet. Heavy machinery, conveyor belts, and cooling systems shut down as power lines go dead for 18 hours at a time. Factory owners walk through dim workshops, running their fingers along idle equipment, calculating their losses for the day. Each blackout becomes more than a technical failure. It becomes a chain reaction of broken contracts, unpaid wages, and dreams slowly collapsing under the weight of unpredictability. For the miners working under the rising price of gold, the frustration is even sharper. Gold prices are soaring globally, but Zimbabwe's mines cannot take advantage of this historic moment because their drilling rigs and ore crushers depend on stable electricity that simply doesn't exist. The deeper tragedy is that Zimbabwe's dependence on the Kariba Dam, once a source of national pride, has turned into a weakness. Its water levels have dropped so drastically that the reservoir now rests at 9% capacity. Engineers at the dam walk along the cracked, sun-baked edges of the basin, looking out over what used to be a thriving body of water. Their faces reveal the emotion that numbers alone can't capture: disbelief, exhaustion, and an unsettling sense of helplessness. And the World Bank puts a number to that despair: 6.1% of GDP lost annually due to blackouts. These aren't abstract percentages. They are the shattered remains of small businesses, the fading ambitions of young graduates, and the slow decay of local hospitals forced to ration power as though it were medicine. Adding to this hardship is another structural problem: Zimbabwe is landlocked. Every drop of fuel must travel hundreds of kilometers through neighboring countries before it reaches Zimbabwean soil. Truck convoys stretch across borders, delayed by inspections, paperwork, corruption, and rising transport costs. A single disrupted border crossing can throw the entire country's supply chain into chaos. For years, this geography turned Zimbabwe into a high-risk environment that scared off most investors. And with sanctions, political volatility, and bureaucratic stagnation, Zimbabwe became one of the places global capital avoided. But while most investors saw a minefield, one man saw opportunity: Aliko Dangote. Africa's richest man has built an empire by understanding something simple yet profound: whoever solves the how do we move, it problem ends up controlling entire markets. As one logistic expert from Nairobi once said, in Africa, transport is more powerful than the product itself. Dangote understood this truth early in his career. He watched countries in southern Africa hemorrhage money on fuel imports from Asia and Europe, each shipment tied to volatile global prices and fragile supply chains. In 2015, Dangote approached Zimbabwe for the first time. He met President Robert Mugabe and outlined a vision worth $1 billion spanning cement, fertilizer, and industrial development. Those present recall Dangote's confidence, his clarity, and his willingness to take on difficult environments. But the optimism in that room soon evaporated. Behind closed doors, senior officials allegedly demanded mediation fees, a polite phrase masking corruption. These demands grew until Dangote's team reached a breaking point. And so, in a move many didn't expect, he walked away. For 10 years, Zimbabwe remained stuck, its energy crisis worsening, its industries weakening, and its political landscape shifting. When Mugabe was removed in 2017 and Mnangagwa took power under the slogan, "Zimbabwe is open for business," the world waited for renewal. But slogans alone cannot erase decades of dysfunction. This is why what happened on November 12, 2021 in Randbenchans when 2025 shocked so many observers. Standing in the State House in Harare, Dangote returned, this time signing a deal that would change Zimbabwe's trajectory. The value was again $1 billion, but the core of the agreement was far bigger: a 2,000-kilometer pipeline stretching from Walvis Bay in Namibia all the way to Bulawayo. With that signature, Zimbabwe's most persistent problem, energy insecurity, finally met a solution powerful enough to break decades of paralysis. When analysts look back on this moment, many will say the turning point didn't happen in Harare, but years earlier on the coast of Lagos, Nigeria. That's where Aliko Dangote learned a lesson that would eventually set the stage for Zimbabwe's biggest economic gamble in decades. The Lagos refinery, now the largest in the world, wasn't simply an industrial project. It was a rebellion against foreign pricing, foreign control, and foreign assumptions about what Africans could or could not build. Back then, Dangote approached Western and Chinese engineering giants for help. He expected high numbers, but nothing prepared him for what came next. These companies quoted him tens of billions of dollars, figures so inflated that the refinery would not survive financially. Worse, they demanded ownership stakes, wanting not just the money from the project, but partial control of it. That moment, according to people in Dangote's circle, felt like a slap in the face, a reminder that global corporations see Africa less as a partner and more as a playground for profit. Rather than surrender, Dangote made a radical choice. He said he would build it himself. The world scoffed. Experts predicted disaster. Yet Dangote turned to African contractors, African engineers, and African supply chains, people who knew the terrain, understood the environment, and didn't inflate costs. And against all expectations, the project succeeded. The cost a fraction of the foreign estimates. The result, a refinery that now processes 650,000 barrels per day, on track to expand to 1.5 million barrels, bigger than anything in India or Saudi Arabia. That victory changed Dangote forever. It taught him that Africa isn't expensive. Foreign control is expensive. And it taught him something else: the continent had the talent and capacity to build world-class infrastructure without middlemen. This is the mindset Dangote carried with him as he re-entered Zimbabwe. And this is where the story reaches its first major peak. When Dangote returned in 2025, he wasn't just coming to build a pipeline. He was coming to rewrite the laws of logistics in southern Africa. He had mapped out the numbers years earlier. Countries like Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, and Malawi were bleeding billions importing fuel from Asia and Europe. Every shipment carried hidden costs: port fees, long-distance transport, currency fluctuations, and supply chain risk. For Dangote, the logic was simple: if he could solve the movement of fuel, he could dominate the market. But beneath that business logic lay a deeper emotional tension, one rooted in Zimbabwe's own political history. When Dangote walked into the State House in Harare on November 12th, insiders noticed something curious. Both of Zimbabwe's vice presidents, Chiwenga and Mohadi, were absent. In normal times, absence might mean nothing. But in Zimbabwean politics, absence is often louder than presence. Their empty seats raised immediate questions among diplomats and local analysts. Was there internal resistance to the deal? Did some factions within ZANU-PF feel sidelined or threatened? Were there disagreements about who would benefit or who would control the pipeline once completed? These questions rippled through Harare's political circles like an electric current. Meanwhile, Western oil companies observed the signing with a different kind of discomfort. For decades, Africa's major energy arteries were shaped by foreign state-owned giants or Western consortia. Now, an African billionaire was doing what they claimed was too costly, too risky, or too complex, and doing it at 1/10 of their price. Chinese strategists reacted similarly. A pipeline that bypassed their influence running from an Atlantic port all the way to the heart of southern Africa threatened to dilute their long-term grip on regional logistics. The second peak of tension came from a question whispered in economic circles: what if Dangote becomes too powerful? Once the pipeline becomes operational, Zimbabwe, being landlocked, will rely almost entirely on Dangote's supply network. Botswana, Zambia, and Malawi may follow. Some experts warn of a potential regional monopoly. They imagine a future where Dangote could raise prices and no one could walk away because no alternative exists. Yet others see something different, a businessman doing what Western and Chinese firms have done for decades. Only this time, the profits and infrastructure stay on African soil. The climax of this chapter is not just the signing of a deal, it is the collision of hope, fear, and long-awaited possibility. Dangote sees a captive market. Zimbabwe sees a lifeline, foreign powers see a threat, and the rest of Africa wonders whether this marks the beginning of a new era where African megaprojects are built by African hands for African interests. This is the moment when the story stops being about a pipeline and becomes a question of continental power. To understand the weight of this deal on everyday people, you have to picture how Zimbabwe's cities have lived for years. In Bulawayo, the country's second-largest city, and the endpoint of the future pipeline, residents have grown accustomed to lining up for fuel before dawn. Some carry plastic containers, others push old motorbikes, all waiting for supply trucks that might arrive or might not. A single delay at a border crossing can mean an entire week of dry pumps. And every hour spent in those lines steals time from work, family, and survival. Now imagine the reaction when news broke that a 2,000-kilometer pipeline would run directly into their city. For the first time in years, many Zimbabweans allowed themselves to feel something unfamiliar: relief. Fuel delivered through a controlled, reliable pipeline means fewer shortages, fewer lines, fewer inflated prices during crises. It means transportation costs, one of the biggest barriers to business, will drop. Taxi drivers, delivery operators, and small manufacturers all stand to feel that impact immediately. But the ripple goes far deeper. Factories that have spent fortunes burning diesel to keep machines running now see a chance to return to full production. In the industrial districts outside Harare, managers walk through their dormant plants, imagining a future where they no longer shut down twice a day. Even hospital administrators feel hope. With stable fuel and connected power projects, hospitals can run imaging machines, operating theaters, and emergency generators without constantly calculating how much diesel remains in their underground tanks. This isn't just about cheaper fuel, it's about the return of predictability, something Zimbabwe hasn't enjoyed in decades. On the national scale, the economic implications are huge. The government currently spends billions in foreign currency importing refined fuel from distant markets. Those dollars, hard-earned and limited, leave the continent and rarely return. But with Dangote's supply coming from the Atlantic coast directly through the pipeline, Zimbabwe can dramatically cut foreign currency losses. Economists estimate that the savings alone could fund new hospitals, repair major highways, and upgrade schools that have gone without maintenance for years. Yet the greatest opportunity lies in the mining sector. Zimbabwe sits on vast deposits of lithium, platinum, and gold. But mining requires consistent electricity and affordable fuel. With energy-stabilized, mining companies can run at full capacity, generating revenue that could rapidly grow the national economy. Some analysts even suggest that Zimbabwe might finally break past the 6% growth ceiling that has limited it for so long. But for every benefit, there is a political shadow. Inside ZANU-PF, Zimbabwe's ruling party, the pipeline deal triggered quiet but intense debate. The absence of both Vice Presidents Chiwenga and Mohadi during the signing was not lost on political observers. Their empty seats symbolized internal tension. Some insiders fear that allowing a single private actor to control a nation's fuel lifeline could become a political vulnerability. What happens if Dangote raises prices? What if relations sour years later? What if Zimbabwe becomes dependent on a corporate partner instead of a foreign government? These questions have echoed in parliamentary hallways and among senior military officials who worry about national security implications. A pipeline is not just infrastructure, it is a strategic artery. Whoever controls it wields influence over the nation's stability. On the regional level, reactions are mixed. Botswana welcomes the transit fees and sees opportunity. Zambia and Malawi watch with cautious interest, knowing they might join the network. But South Africa and Mozambique, who currently serve as Zimbabwe's main transport routes, face potential economic losses. The shift could reduce their leverage significantly. Ordinary citizens, however, feel something simpler: hope. Hope that their children can learn under electric lights. Hope that businesses can grow without fear of power cuts. Hope that a landlocked country can finally rewrite its fate. This deal is not merely an investment, it is a test of whether Zimbabwe can turn new opportunity into lasting progress, or whether old political fractures will once again hold the nation back. From Washington's perspective, what happened in Harare 3 days ago is not a local African business deal. It is a restructuring of power, quiet, strategic, and deeply unsettling for those accustomed to shaping Africa's energy future. In U.S. policy circles, there is a clear understanding energy is influence, and whoever manages the infrastructure that moves it often shapes political outcomes. For decades, this influence rotated between Western companies and more recently Chinese state-owned giants. But an African-owned megaproject designed and executed without Western or Chinese financing breaks that pattern. Inside certain think tanks in D.C., analysts are already asking uncomfortable questions. If African corporations can build billion-dollar corridors at African prices, where does that leave the U.S.? Is this the beginning of an Africa-centered supply chain system that excludes us? The anxiety is not always spoken aloud, but it is present especially among those who remember how China swept across Africa with loans and infrastructure 2 decades ago. Chinese observers feel a different kind of tension. For Beijing, Africa has long been the continent where their state-owned enterprises build ports, rails, and pipelines. Chinese engineers have been the ones drawing the maps. Chinese companies have been the ones shaping trade routes. Now, a pipeline running from Walvis Bay to Bulawayo, built without their fingerprints, challenges their long-standing assumption that Africa needs Chinese expertise to execute large-scale projects. One Chinese strategist reportedly remarked, "An African pipeline that bypasses Chinese logistics is more symbolic than it appears." Symbolism matters in geopolitics, especially when it signals a shift in capability and confidence. Meanwhile, European energy firms are watching with the wary eyes of competitors who sense a market slipping away. For years, they quoted Africa prices that were inflated, sometimes absurd, always justified by phrases like risk premium or unstable environment. Dangote's pipeline exposes a truth many of them preferred to bury: Africa was never too expensive to build in. Foreign companies simply charged Africa more. Now, with a continental billionaire setting what looks like a new standard, those inflated margins are harder to explain. But perhaps the most interesting reactions are coming not from governments, but from global economists. Many argue that Dangote is not just building infrastructure, he is engineering demand. His Lagos refinery will soon produce up to 1.5 million barrels per day. A pipeline feeding Zimbabwe, then potentially Zambia, Botswana, and Malawi creates a consumption network perfectly aligned with his refining capacity. It is a deliberate strategy, almost textbook in its design: secure the supply, then build the distribution channels, then lock in the market. Some American economists liken it to Amazon's early strategy, constructing warehouses before consumers even knew they needed next-day delivery. In the same way, Dangote is building pipelines before demand is fully measured, creating a future that fits his production rather than waiting for the market to shape itself. But outside economics and strategy, there is a growing conversation about what this moment represents symbolically. In African diaspora communities in the U.S., especially among older Black Americans who remember the struggles for civil rights and independence movements across Africa, this kind of deal feels historic. It represents agency, it represents dignity, and it echoes a broader continental movement, the same one embodied by leaders like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who is championing resource sovereignty and African-led development. To the world, the Zimbabwe pipeline is a business decision. To Africa, it may become a turning point. To Washington and Beijing, it is a signal. A new competitor has entered the field, not a foreign superpower, but Africa itself. In Africa, there is an old saying, rain doesn't fall on one roof alone. And as simple as it sounds, that proverb captures the entire meaning of what is unfolding in Zimbabwe. Yes, the pipeline will first bring relief to Bulawayo's factories, Zimbabwe's truck drivers and its hospitals struggling under the weight of diesel dependence. But the rain never falls on one roof. It spreads, it drifts, it seeps into neighboring ground. And this project, this single line of steel stretching 2,000 kilometers across 3 countries, has the potential to water an entire region. The question now is not whether Dangote profits. He will. The question is whether Zimbabwe can turn this moment into something bigger than a pipeline. Will cheap, reliable fuel finally give the country enough breathing room to build? Will the government use its saved foreign currency to modernize schools, hospitals, and rural communities long forgotten by political promises? Will Zimbabwe dare to industrialize refining its lithium, transforming its platinum, and manufacturing its own goods instead of sending raw minerals overseas? Or will it simply replace one dependency with another? Dependencies wearing different faces, speaking different languages, but functioning the same way. These are the crossroads where nations write their destinies. Because beneath all the numbers, all the logistics, and all the geopolitical tension lies a deeper truth, one that resonates strongly with older Americans watching Africa rise with a new kind of determination. The real revolution in Africa is not televised. It is not announced in speeches, it is not live-streamed from global summits. It moves quietly beneath the radar, inside the pipes, across the supply chains, and through the minds of a generation determined to break the cycles of extraction and dependency. We see it in the Sahel, we see it in West Africa, we see it in the bold leadership of men like President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, who has turned sovereignty into a practical tool rather than a political slogan. And today we see it in Zimbabwe's decision to open its doors, not to old powers, but to a new African industrial model, one built by African hands, priced at African costs, and designed for African futures. As Africa news continues to shift, as supply chains rewrite themselves, as pressure builds between Washington, Beijing, and a rising African private sector, one thing becomes clear: the continent is no longer waiting for permission to build. So here is my final question to you, especially to those of you who have lived long enough to witness Africa's past struggles and today's turning points. Do you believe this African-led model of development is finally strong enough to break the pattern of dependency? Or is the continent simply entering a new phase with new players, but the same old vulnerabilities? I want your honest perspective. Please share this video if you feel Africa deserves the right to build at African prices. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than the headlines. Your voice shapes this conversation, and this conversation shapes how the world understands Africa's future.